The billionaire sat in handcuffs under a courthouse skylight that poured cold noon light like judgment. Cole Mercer said, "Keep breathing," and the cuffs clicked with each pulse. A 7-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat stared as if measuring his soul. The marble floor mirrored him badly, splitting his face along the grout. The guards stood still, statues pretending to be human. Camera flashes hissed outside like rain against glass. The voice said, "He built an empire." Cole Mercer said, "But I couldn't save her." The truth landed like a dropped gavel, heavy and ringing. He searched the child's eyes and found a kindness that did not reach her mouth. He wondered who she had lost to learn that look so young. He lowered his gaze as if bowing to an altar he never believed in. Somewhere an elevator rose, and the cables sang a thin metallic hymn. He felt the past wake up inside him, stretching, smiling, asking for due payment. The glass tower held the night like a museum of regrets. Cole Mercer sat alone with the city on every wall. The time cover lay on the table like a trophy left in a crime scene. He pressed his palms to his eyes and saw static. Cole Mercer said, "I'm not crying," and the room disagreed gently. The HVAC whispered like a bored confessional. The skyline glittered and did not blink. A decanter held 2 fingers of whiskey, unclaimed and judging. He read an acquisition term that tasted like ash. His reflection looked back as if interviewed by the dark. The voice said, "He built an empire." Cole Mercer said, "But I couldn't save her." Sirens braided through the street grid below, red and blue threads sewing the night shut. Somewhere a printer woke and spat a page like a sigh. He stayed still and let the silence take the chair beside him. The holding room was a lesson in fluorescent honesty. Cole Mercer rehearsed the face of a man with nothing to hide. The mirror in the glass returned a man who had cached everything. He sat, cuffs resting on metal, and timed his breath to the hum. Cole Mercer said, "You promised to be bigger than failure," and the promise tasted like rust. He remembered plastic chairs and a closed door that never opened. A memory creaked like an old hinge and let grief step through. The clock on the wall stuttered between seconds, as if embarrassed. He pictured the child in the yellow raincoat, a witness without malice. The voice said, "You built this to save someone," and silence replied, "Name her." Cole Mercer said, "I know," and his throat narrowed like a corridor. The guard tapped the window and pointed to time as if it were a person. He straightened the line of his jacket as if it mattered. The chairs scraped, loud as thunder in a small sky. They led him toward the corridor, where the child still waited. The security rope made a thin border between 2 worlds. Cole Mercer said, "I'll go quietly," and the words felt like a key turning. The officers nodded and became scenery again. He met the girl's stare and held it with care, not force. The marble looked slick enough to swallow a step. "Yeah." A camera shutter ricocheted and died. He found a steadiness he used to rent from victory. The voice said, "He built an empire," and the echo added, "Now build a truth." Cole Mercer said, "I hear you," and meant it. He did not ask forgiveness with his eyes. He let the moment pass without grabbing it. The elevator chimed as if blessing the transition. He inhaled as if the air had a cost, and he could afford it. The steps were slick with drizzle and microphones. Reporters surged like a tide wearing shoes. Cole Mercer kept his eyes down, and his spine level. Flashbulbs stitched bright seams across the gray afternoon. Cole Mercer said, "Hold your ground," and the ground felt mobile and thin. The crowd tasted the air for scandal and salt. He heard his name turned into a question, then a verdict, then a brand. The cuffs flashed like jewelry no one wanted. The voice said, "He built an empire," and the wind answered, "But at what price?" Cole Mercer said, "I know the invoice," and the words did not tremble. A siren flared and faded like a doubt. The rain sharpened the city into outlines he recognized. The car door opened and became a mouth. He stepped into the dark and left the cameras arguing with the rain. The discount store hummed like a tired beehive, while the heater coughed. Cole Mercer watched from a bench as his mother pled her case 2 aisles away. The manager held her resume like a damp ticket. Cole Mercer said, "I'll never be the one waiting." The overhead lights flickered and made everything look cheaper than it was. His mother kept her shoulders straight, because dignity is free. The manager said something about experience, which meant nothing about hunger. Cole Mercer felt the world measuring them in inches and pennies. He studied the help wanted sign that kept its distance. He counted shoes that walked away instead of helping. A radio jingle promised savings no one could afford. The register beeped like a faint heartbeat. He clenched a fist and hid it in his pocket. The promise climbed his throat and branded him from the inside. Cole Mercer said, "I will build a door that opens for us," and the words burned clean. The ER smelled like bleach and coins. "Mr. Wars one bunweed." June Mercer coughed behind a curtain while forms shuffled past like birds avoiding a storm. Teen Cole gripped a pen that wouldn't work. Cole Mercer said, "Please," and the words slid off the counter. A clock blinked 2:13 a.m., as if shy about time. A nurse smiled with the sadness of rules. The billing office lit its window like a lighthouse that saves only ships with sponsors. June's cough climbed a rung and stalled there. The curtain didn't move until her breath did. Cole Mercer said, "I'll make mercy automatic," and the sentence scared him. He learned that waiting rooms are built from hours, not chairs. He watched a janitor mop courage off the floor. A doctor appeared like weather and left like math. The pen worked when it was too late. The form accepted his signature and rejected his hope. The cemetery wore a coat of wet grass and low sky. The headstone was simple, because grief refuses decoration. His mother folded a tissue into a square that could never be big enough. Cole Mercer said, "I will never be this powerless again." The wind threaded his jacket like a tailor with cold hands. A pastor spoke sentences that landed without roots. The dirt waited with patient appetite. Cole traced the letters of her name and felt the alphabet turn heavy. He learned that silence can carry more weight than eulogies. A crow settled on a branch and watched the living behave. Cole Mercer said, "I'll build something no one can close." The promise felt both holy and dangerous. He stood straighter because vows like height. His mother squeezed his fingers once and let go. The car door sighed open as if it knew the script. The road out of the cemetery looked longer than the road in. The dorm room smelled like coffee and old ambition. A cracked desk lamp turned code into a map. Lena Quinn hunched over a broken laptop and smiled like a fuse catching. Lena Quinn said, "Your encryption wants applause." Cole Mercer said, "Who doesn't?" and the joke steadied them. The radiator ticked like a small clock refusing orders. They drew a system on a whiteboard that wanted to be a door. Ramen cooled and went uneaten. They talked about hospitals and invoices that felt like threats. Lena Quinn said, "What if grace can scale?" Cole Mercer said, "What if debt can't?" The night stretched until dawn forgot its job. A neighbor banged once and gave up. The screen threw light on their tired faces and made them look brave. In the margin he wrote a name he did not yet deserve. The window fogged with hope and stayed that way. Years later, the boardroom door closed on Lena like a soft guillotine. She stood with her pitch deck and her calm fury. Lena Quinn said, "I founded this," and the table looked away. Cole Mercer felt the old promise step forward and take his mouth. He knocked once and the lock answered with policy. A man explained risk as if it were gravity he owned. Lena kept her chin high because altitude is earned. Cole Mercer said, "We are not asking," and learned how a tone can become a tool. The door stayed shut, so he measured the hinges instead of the men. He understood that power fits better when it is tailored. He pictured June, and the ER clock, and the phone that swallowed hope. The hallway smelled like money and lemons. The elevator dinged, and no one moved. Lena Quinn said, "We build our own room," and the sentence became an address. The apartment ran on caffeine and borrowed faith. Cables braided the floor like roots looking for rain. The whiteboard begged for a wall it could keep. Cole Mercer said, "We launch or we vanish." Lena Quinn said, "We fix the bill that broke your sister." He let the room hear the vow and carry it. Laptops glowed like stubborn hearths in a winter town. They named the engine Helix Pay and fed it nights. Code became a ladder no one else would hold. Rent notices curled in the draft and pretended to sleep. Friends texted, forgave, and then stopped. Cole Mercer said, "We will make mercy routine." Lena Quinn said, "And make debt run out of excuses." The server coughed and then sang. Dawn pressed a gray thumbprint on the glass. He missed a call from his mother and saved the apology. He sketched flows that turned invoices into exits. Bugs multiplied like rumors and died like gnats. Coffee etched his nerves into wire and hope. The hospital boardroom smelled of lemon and paper. Contracts lay like sleeping snakes between water glasses. The administrator praised outcomes and watched margins. Cole Mercer said, "We lower fees at the bedside." Lena Quinn said, "We published the savings, not the spin." The man smiled as if he had invented approval. He tapped an exclusivity clause that purred. Cole felt the trap, but liked the door it opened. June's cough folded behind the curtain of years. He signed and called it a bridge, not a chain. The handshake clicked like a latch on a bright cage. Reporters rehearsed hope into tidy paragraphs. Helix Pay trended and stole their sleep for a week. A nurse wrote that a family cried over a bill turned zero. The team clapped and stared at the clause again. Lena said, "We can fix it later." Cole said, "Later has thin walls." The check cleared, and so did doubt for a minute. Nights grew teeth and bit the calendar clean. The wind tasted like metal and would not leave. Time became a hallway with no doors. Birthdays drifted past like balloons snagging on power lines. Cole recorded greetings in airport bathrooms with soft acoustics. He mailed gifts from kiosks and called it love. Lena ate cake with interns and saved him a slice. Cole Mercer said, "Almost there," to everyone and to no one. Investors praised growth and ignored eyes. The algorithm learned habits they no longer had. His mother answered and let silence do the harder work. Calendar alerts blinked and died like small stars. He watched planes taxi and treated patients like fuel. Lena Quinn said, "Be human with me," he said after the next round. The server room sang a single merciful note. Success arrived wearing hunger as a mask. Wins piled up and refused to weigh anything. Friends married time while he married scale. He dreamed of June breathing without fear. The dream ended at the clause that owned their corridor. He woke with numbers dry on his tongue. At 2 a.m., the office turned into a confession booth. Cole slid into a terminal and became Nightingale. The mask felt like air he could finally afford. Logs opened like locked drawers and offered their sins. He rerouted fees from predatory pools into zero. Cole Mercer said, "This is for June." The words steadied his hands like rails. Balances flipped and breathed like people waking. He cut around firewalls with a surgeon's calm. A map of accounts lit the screen like a storm. He promised to stop when the scales looked right. The night asked which measure could bless theft. He answered with another script and a stopwatch. Lena slept 2 floors down and trusted him. He titled the folder Mercy and hid it in plain sight. Headlines praised Helix Pay while he erased their cause. The clock stalled at 3:03, as if shocked. He pictured the curtain finally moving. He saved a block of families and none of himself. Dawn arrived and made the mask look obvious. Friends peeled off like decals in rain. One lifted code and left a thank you in silence. Another sent photos from a wedding he missed twice. Cole laughed too loudly at a joke no one made. Lena asked for a weekend that held only air. Lena Quinn said, "Be here with me," he said after the next raise. The rooftop offered a view that forgave nothing. The city hummed, hungry and bright as a marquee. Lena's hair caught the wind, and her eyes stayed still. She said, "I want the man, not the headline." He said, "I am both and neither." She took his hand, and felt the tremor he denied. A drone wandered by like a nosy thought, and left. He pictured the girl in the yellow raincoat watching him. He pictured cuffs and a child's quiet verdict. The night cooled the concrete and warmed their doubt. Lena said, "We can still turn back." He said, "We only know forward." The promise nodded and charged interest he would pay later. The news broke like a windshield. Headlines looped across monitors in an endless crawl. Cole Mercer stared at a name he trusted, stapled to shell companies disguised as charity. Eleanor Cade smiled from a photo like nothing had happened. Cole Mercer said, "No," but the word cracked in the middle. The office lights felt harsher than usual, every shadow turning into a question. He remembered the first handshake, the way she had praised his instincts. Now those instincts felt like accomplices. The air conditioner coughed like it was trying not to laugh. Lena Quinn stood in the doorway, her phone still lit with the same headline. The contracts on his desk suddenly looked like crime scenes. The voice said, "You built an empire." He answered, "She built the trap." Outside, sirens stitched the city's fabric tighter. He closed the laptop, but the reflection still showed the article's title burned into his eyes. Lena Quinn's voice was low, but edged. She had followed the money through the code they had once written together. Lena said, "You did this to erase pain, but you funded something worse." Cole Mercer said, "I never meant," but the words collapsed under the weight of the data. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and rain on pavement. Outside, people hurried without looking in. Lena's eyes didn't waver, even as her fingers tightened on the mug. Cole tried to find a sentence that didn't sound like an excuse. The steam between them curled and faded like patience. The voice said, "You built an empire." Lena added, "You built a lie without knowing it." He wondered if ignorance was a defense or just another crime. He wished the rain would drown the conversation, but it didn't. The exposé didn't say his name, but the pattern screamed it. Nightingale's movements mirrored Helix Pay's winds, like a shadow that knew the choreography. The payouts labeled as patient relief looped back to campaign accounts. Cole Mercer said, "You could have called me." Lena Quinn said, "I did. For 2 years." The clock read 3:04 a.m., but the city outside his apartment still breathed in neon. The cursor on the screen blinked like it was counting down. Empty takeout boxes leaned against the trash can. Cole scrolled, each paragraph cutting deeper into his own fingerprints. The voice said, "You built an empire." The article whispered, and left the door open. He thought about deleting it all, but deletion felt like another kind of cowardice. Gabriel Mercer walked into the boardroom like he'd been waiting for this day since birth. He dropped a folder thick with patents onto the table. Gabriel said technically, "They're mine." Cole Mercer said, "We built this together." Gabriel smiled with all teeth and no warmth. The skyline behind him was sharp enough to cut. Papers slid across the glossy table like accusations in disguise. Cole remembered signing them years ago when the company was still a gamble. The voice said, "You built an empire." Gabriel added, "You built it on my name." The room smelled faintly of cologne and competition. Cole's hands stayed flat on the table, but his pulse kicked at the inside of his wrists. Eleanor Cade called the shareholder vote, with the calm of someone ordering coffee. Hands rose like a tide with no moon. Cole Mercer said, "Let me speak," but the mic was off. The floor seemed to shift under his shoes. Numbers clicked into place on a screen, sealing him out. A whisper somewhere said, "No way," but disbelief had no voting rights. The voice said, "You built an empire." The silence answered, "Not anymore." Cole watched the legacy he'd sweated into existence drift into other hands. Eleanor smiled, professional and unbroken. He wondered if she practiced it in mirrors. The room's air felt thin enough to ration. Cole Mercer stood in a bare studio with one soft light, and no logo behind him. His hands didn't shake, but the words threatened to. Cole Mercer said, "I'm Cole Mercer, I am Nightingale." The admission landed like glass on tile. He spoke about debt erased in secret, about laws that protected profit more than lives. He said, "I let a mentor turn my mercy into a weapon, and I let my brother cash it in." The live feed climbed into 100 million screens. No applause, no cross-examination, just the weight of a confession in an unbranded room. The voice said, "You built an empire." Cole answered, "On the wrong foundation." His eyes didn't flinch even when silence pressed harder than any question. Somewhere a broadcast tech swallowed, remembering his sister's bill. The red light on the camera went dark, but the truth stayed lit in him. The government office smelled like ink and decisions. Cole Mercer slid a folder across the table to the Attorney General. He said, "These files will scorch me too." The edges moved like someone checking for traps. The blinds cut daylight into even stripes. Every page inside was a loaded charge, proof of the scheme, proof of his part. Cole's heartbeat marked time under the paperwork's weight. He felt like he was amputating something that had once been useful. The AG said nothing, but his pen moved with surgical precision. The voice said, "You built an empire." Cole replied, "Now I'm dismantling it." A copier hummed somewhere, oblivious. When the folder left his hands, so did the last shield he had. His mother's voice was quiet on the phone. Cole let her speak first. She finally said, "June would have liked the bird." He saw the courthouse child in her yellow coat, the plush bird tied to her wrist. Cole Mercer said, "I know." The air between them softened, but the years didn't. He sat at the small kitchen table, looking at the chair that had always been hers. The refrigerator hummed like it was listening. The voice said, "You built an empire." She said, "You built a cage around yourself." He didn't argue. He had no interest in winning here. The call ended without goodbye, just the click of understanding. The museum steps smelled faintly of rain. Lena Quinn sat on a bench beneath a banner, advertising wonders. Cole Mercer said, "I'm sorry for making you carry the truth alone." Lena said, "I'm sorry for still wanting you to be the man who didn't need rescuing." The words made a loop they couldn't untangle. They leaned into each other, not for comfort, but for acknowledgement. The city moved behind them, indifferent and constant. The voice said, "You built an empire." Lena added, "You can build yourself next." They stayed there until the banner's shadow reached their feet. The boardroom felt smaller for the final session. Cole Mercer stood before the table and said, "Remove me." The vote was unanimous, and quicker than any other. He watched his name disappear from the title strip. The empty chair looked relieved. Eleanor Kate avoided his eyes, which was its own kind of admission. The voice said, "You built an empire." Cole answered, "And now I'm leaving it standing without me." The gavel fell with no drama, just finality. He walked out without looking back. The first week without an office sounded louder than any boardroom. Cole Mercer sat at a small desk in his apartment, pen dragging over thick paper. He said, "What did I actually build?" Letters stacked in front of him, each one to a family whose debt had vanished. No return address, no logo, just his name in black ink. Sunlight spilled across the page, slow and unhurried. Coffee steamed beside him, cooling in a chipped mug. The voice said, "You built an empire." He answered, "Now I'm building a truth I can live in." Outside, someone laughed on the street, and it sounded like something worth keeping. He sealed another envelope and set it aside, the pile growing like a new kind of equity. The children's ward smelled faintly of crayons and antiseptic. Cole Mercer stepped inside without cameras. The girl from the courthouse sat in bed, yellow sweater replacing her raincoat. A plush bird perched on her ivy pole. Cole said, "That a nightingale?" She nodded solemnly. Machines hummed like distant waves. The light through the blinds striped the floor. He sat beside her, not to be a savior, but to be present. The voice said, "You built an empire." Cole thought, but this is what matters. They spoke in short bursts about birds, colors, and how rain makes sidewalks shine. When he left, she waved with the hand not tethered to the IV. Lena Quinn spoke to a packed lecture hall about truth and the cost of carrying it. Cole waited on the steps outside, holding 2 paper coffees. Students spilled out, buzzing with her words. She spotted him and smiled, half in surprise, half in memory. Cole Mercer said, "We were good builders, you and me." Lena said, "We still are. If the building is a person." The city air carried the smell of leaves and cold stone. He handed her the coffee, and they sat on the wide steps like they once had in a dorm hallway. The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, "And I'm still building." Gabriel's text read, "You always wanted the crown." Cole typed, "I wanted the key," then deleted it. Instead, he called his lawyer. They spoke about transferring his remaining shares into a trust with rules that protected patients, not profits. The lawyer said, "You'll be locking yourself out." Cole said, "That's the point." The city outside his window blinked with slow traffic lights. He felt something inside unclench. The voice said, "You built an empire." He replied, "Now I'm protecting the door." Eleanor Cade's resignation scrolled across the ticker as misalignment of mission. Cole Mercer watched from his couch, remote untouched. He said, "Words are mirrors. Some show the back of your head." The news anchor's voice droned on about market impacts. He didn't smile, but he did feel something like air returning to a locked room. The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, "And I finally let go of it." The TV flickered in the dim room, casting light on a man who no longer needed a stage. The courtroom was colder than he remembered. Cole Mercer stood as the judge read the sentence, the words steady but heavy. He didn't flinch, not because he was unafraid, but because fear had already taken its best shot years ago. Cole Mercer said, "I accept." The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, "And I'm still paying for it." The air was thin, each breath measured. His lawyer nodded once, no comfort, just acknowledgement. He imagined June in the back row, not to forgive him but to see him keep his word. The gavel hit wood, sharp and final. He felt smaller, and somehow more himself. As he stepped into the courthouse lobby, the security rope was gone. The girl in the yellow sweater stood waiting, a folded paper in her hands. She said, "I drew you a bird." Cole took the page, the nightingale sketched in crayon, looking less like a mask and more like something that could sing. Cole Mercer said, "Thank you," the words lighter than any he'd spoken in months. The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, and she built a reminder. She smiled and tucked her hands into her pockets, as if to say her part was done. Lena Quinn met him on the courthouse steps, no agenda in her eyes. Cole Mercer said, "I want a smaller, truer life." Lena said, "Be careful, small things are the hardest to build." They both laughed, the sound stripped of old weight. The city hummed below, cars threading through wet streets. The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, "Now I want to build days that don't need defending." They walked down the steps together, not in a hurry. At his mother's kitchen table, the rice steamed the way she'd taught him. Cole Mercer said, "I'll be gone for a while." She took his hand and said, "Bring back the man who sits at tables." The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, "She's asking me to build a person." The warmth of the food reached his face before it reached his stomach. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that could heal if you let it. The hospital garden was still, moonlight spilling over the benches. Cole Mercer sat beneath a tree, looking up through the branches. He said softly, "June, I left the company," then added, "But I never left you." The leaves shifted, as if in answer. The voice said, "You built an empire." He thought, "And I'm leaving something better." The air was cool enough to feel clean in his lungs. Somewhere inside, machines hummed a lullaby. He stayed until the garden belonged to the night entirely.